Hi, I'm Owen, and welcome to Casting the Net, a new youth-led series hosted by teens for teens, exploring the breadth and depth of our online worlds. In each episode, we cast the net wide to learn about the opportunities and challenges the internet brings and hear from experts around the globe. The rapid expansion of the internet within society has led to marked changes in the ways individuals communicate, think, and how they live their lives. Traditionally, we got our news from trusted sources, journalists and media outlets, that are required to follow strict codes of practice. However, the internet has enabled a whole new way to publish, share, and consume information and news, with very little regulation or editorial standards. This is due to rapid spreading of mis- and disinformation, as well as the amplification of radical views and extremist conspiracy theories. Recent events here in Ireland indicate a rise in far-right radicalisation that plays on local concerns and national issues. We've seen far-right activists weaponize social media platforms to incite fear, anger, and increasingly racist commentary. While the popularity of online personalities who promote controversial ideologies, misogyny, and extreme agendas continues to cause concern about the influence they have on their followers. So, is online extremism growing in Ireland, and what is its influence? To find out more, I'm joined by Ciarán O'Connor, Senior Analyst at the London-based Institute for Strategic Dialogue, an organisation that researches disinformation, extremism, and hate online. Thanks for joining me, Ciarán. Could you start by telling us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Yeah, so first of all, about ISD, as you say, it's London-based, although myself, I'm based here in Ireland. We're a think tank, an NGO, a charity, essentially an organisation that, as you say, researches online disinformation, extremism, hate, all these bad things, let's say. We're funded predominantly by programme grants from a variety of governments or foundations or companies, but we're independent of our funders, as are a lot of NGOs in this kind of space. So that means we don't accept funding tied to coming to a specific conclusion, these kinds of things, which is very important when you are conducting research, that the findings aren't swayed by the funding behind it. Our funders are listed on our website, so this idea of transparency is essential to the work we do, and we're non-partisan. So we work with different partners and donors whose values align with our mission to protect democracy and do so by fighting extremism, hate, and disinformation. So a lot of my work revolves around looking at extremist groups or movements or trends online in Ireland, but in the UK and in Europe and in the US, predominantly because I'm an English language speaker mainly. That's where my expertise or my experience lies. So a lot of my work day to day involves, as I said, looking at these kinds of trends or groups or movements, and also looking at emerging conspiracy theory narratives as they may be playing out. So COVID was a big one for that, for many, many reasons that I'm sure we'll get into. And then the other side of my job is kind of online open source investigations. So kind of taking some of the tools and experience that I learned within Storyful and applying them to digital investigation. So if you have something like an email address, can you try and track where that email address might have been used online? Can you try and track who's behind the email address for various investigatory needs as related to my job, but also kind of other projects as well. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. But yeah, disinformation, extremism, and hate is kind of what I do.
Sounds like you've been quite busy. Would you say there is a growing influence by online extremists on protests on the ground in Ireland?
Yes, almost certainly. And not even just recently, but if you go back to 2018, 2019, which is when we saw the most recent, prior to this period, the most recent flare up in opposition and protesting against the management and housing of asylum seekers here in Ireland. A lot of the same figures who are active in promoting protests then are active now. And there's a difference, first of all, that we must strike and be very clear in, that there are local communities who are unsettled or frustrated or disenfranchised in some way because they have been not consulted or haven't been listened to, or essentially these are the people who have real and genuine concerns, that they're concerns that are based in capabilities of housing, an influx of any kind of new groups to the local population, questions of resources, questions of the ability to make sure that people get their basic needs, these kinds of things that are really a question of resources and capabilities, versus the other side, which is really which kind of gets a lot of the headlines of our agitators, our outside figures, our extremists. And we say extremists because they are propagating or promoting a far right or right wing extremist view of the world. And what that means is people or groups who endorse or support political or social belief systems that have a number of different features. Central to it all is this kind of overt, extreme form of nationalism, but it's a strict kind of nationalism. So it's defined by your ethnicity. So in Irish terms, this is defined by you being white Irish, and the view is that non-natives or non-nationals pose a threat to this nationalism. That means that far-right figures in Ireland, as they do in other countries, also exhibit strong forms of racism or xenophobia, and to varying degrees, they're anti-democratic. So they are top-down as opposed to kind of ruled by democratic votes and group order and these kinds of things. So yes, lots of these figures have been present in protests in 2018, 2019, and in recent months. And the way that this kind of manifests is that in different ways, there's no kind of one approach, but lots of these figures are, first of all, they are all very active online. That is a current feature, a core feature of any kinds of far-right figure active in Ireland, but also abroad. And they use a variety of different social media or messaging platforms to either try and promote their ideology or to try and mobilize, get people from the online to the offline, so protesting on the street. But they also use these same spaces to typically promote or produce themselves false or misleading or exaggerated claims about a number of topics. But right now, a lot of these topics are related to claims that are used to target or try and exclude asylum seekers. And we've seen from East Wall from November onwards in Dublin, that's kind of where the initial flare up in a protest has now spread. And there's a mix of locals who are pissed off about how things have been managed in recent times. And there's a housing crisis, there's a health crisis on top of all these things. But what you see, the kind of thread that ties a lot of these groups together, are figures online who will be saying, tonight it's East Wall, tomorrow it's Ballymun, the night after that it's Mullingar or other places that are currently experiencing these kinds of protests. So yes, so by that very simple measure, yes, there is an increase in the protests and there is an increase in the activity of far-right extremists around these protests as well. Yes.
So you mentioned the influential figures, and we'll come back to those later on. But as you said, we're seeing an increase in the amount of ordinary people getting involved with these groups. So the main question is, how do these extremists influence these local community groups? And how can we separate the concerns of local communities and extremist elements within those groups?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And off the bat, I'll say that if you are protesting against the housing of asylum seekers, that does not automatically make you an extremist of any variety or any persuasion on either left or right or anything like that. No. But if you are protesting on the ethnicity of the people there, or you're shouting and screaming at children or women, out, 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 go back to your own country, these kinds of phrases, then you are moving towards extremism at the very least. Yes, it's very important to distinguish between, first of all, the kinds of opposition towards kind of asylum seekers and how this manifests. Things that come up time and time again is things you might hear on the news is misinformation, disinformation, fake news, false claims, all these kinds of things. It kind of helps to break these down. First of all, they're all rhetoric. They're all ways, means of describing information and the veracity or the degree to which information is true. Misinformation is false or misleading or manipulated content that is presented as fact, regardless of an intent to deceive. So claiming that, I don't know, orange juice cures COVID, and you see your granny sharing it on WhatsApp or on Facebook, or you get the WhatsApp that says forwarded many times. That's probably a good example of misinformation. Your granny hasn't stood over and said, I'm going to make up this false claim now that is going to fool people into consuming more orange juice to cure themselves from COVID. No, they get it, they see it, they think that kind of makes sense to me, and it comes from someone that I generally trust as to be a good consumer of news and a smart person. So you forward it on to the other 5 people you think should know about this. That's what misinformation is. It really lacks the intent. Doesn't mean it's not harmful. It is there's some very egregious and false claims that are misinformation, and they get shared rapidly. but it's really about the intent, and that's kind of what rumors and hoaxes and pranks are misinformation typically. Disinformation is deliberate. D is D. That's kind of the helpful way of thinking about it. Disinformation is false or misleading or manipulated content that is presented as fact, that is intended to deceive or harm. So what you often see with lots of disinformation is that there might be state actors behind it. If you think of the invasion of Ukraine, when President Putin announced the invasion just over a year ago, he said that they were entering the country to remove the Nazis who were controlling the country. There weren't Nazis controlling the country. There was a democratically elected government headed by President Zelensky over there. But in producing and promoting and repeating this claim that it is intended to deceive, it is intended to, first of all, in words towards Russia, create the perception that this is a country that is run by extremists and therefore we are justified in going in. But then it's also to promote that viewpoint to kind of sympathizers around the world, these kinds of things. So false and misleading and exaggerated claims have been at the heart of how far-right agitators or extremists have been discussing the situation regarding asylum seekers here in Ireland in the last number of years. I remember in 2018, 2019 reporting and covering this, that one far-right figure, I could see them entering local groups around the country which were proposed to be housing an asylum seeker centre. And this figure was sharing articles from what I would call a junk news website, a website that really does traffic in exaggerated and kind of fear-mongering content about asylum seekers. And they're posting these articles saying, this is coming to your community, you need to do something now. And that was a way of trying to foster local opposition and to try and turn people against asylum seekers, or foster hostility and fear and suspicion. The same thing is happening right now, but the kind of networks upon which this is occurring are not just Facebook. Now we have Twitter and we have Telegram, and we have WhatsApp and all of these other platforms as well. The claims that are very current right now, something that's kind of grown or developed since, I would say, January onwards, are claims of migrant or asylum seeker criminality. So you might have seen these on TikTok or elsewhere, and it might be on TikTok, but it might be a screenshot from Facebook, and then it might be supported by a screenshot of a tweet from Twitter. You know, there's such a patchwork of things going on here that you have to stand over if you are going to share that yourself. But essentially, claims of migrant criminality. And what ties all of these kinds of claims together is that there might be a screenshot or a video that shows, it might just show one thing. It shows a person walking down the street, but then when the videos are shared, there's an added caption, or the videos are framed in a certain way that typically fosters a claim of criminality against migrants. This is presented as fact, and there's no way to stand over it. There's often no reports made to Gardaí around these things, but you have, first of all, it's like a playbook. The video emerges online, then an anonymous kind of aggregator account. So it might be, you might see it online, it has an Irish tricolour or it calls themselves patriots, these kinds of accounts. It shares it, it frames it as some migrant criminality. Then one of these leading figures will share this with their network. They naturally have a larger platform, and people will believe that they are kind of an activist or acting in the good. They'll say something disparaging or incriminating about migrants, and then it seeps down into local community groups, or it might enter kind of WhatsApp circles or networks. And then it incites people to either protest against this, maybe go to the local Garda station saying, why is there no report? The Garda will say, well, no report was made. Then people will say, well, there's a cover-up. And then you can see how this whole cycle is like a feedback loop where it feeds itself. And the last thing I'll say for I'll throw back to you is that what's so dangerous and harmful right now is the speed at which that feedback loop is kind of taking place. So a claim appears online. The claim is shared by a kind of influential figure. The figure shares this and it kind of seeps into local communities. Communities either protest, or they might say some very harmful or dangerous things about asylum seekers, saying that we need to get them out or burn them out, or these, you know, very dangerous things. That loop, that speed at which these things are happening right now is incredibly fast, and that is all completely different, because this kind of stuff is a form of nativism or ethno-nationalism, where they are targeting these people based essentially on their ethnicity, versus local community groups who are saying, that the locality is not capable of maybe housing 100 or 200 or more asylum seekers. And as I kind of said at the top of the piece, more so concerns based in resources or capabilities. The line can be blurred. Yeah, it's not easy sometimes to read between them, but far right figures or far right activists or groups can typically always come back to that kind of Ireland for the Irish, white Irish, ethnicity based conversations and points like that as well.
Yeah, so I think most people can agree that they've seen these videos or heard that rhetoric repeated by someone in their life. So similarly, in the COVID pandemic, our knowledge of the virus and how to combat it was constantly evolving. So as the best knowledge became available, it changed it changed what people, how people approach the virus. And that new information was sometimes used as a way to discredit the government and previous COVID measures in general. So what are these people's aims? These people such as those spreading, as you said, the loop of disinformation and misinformation. What is their goal? Is it just to spread their ideology, or are there other aspects to it? For example, to make money or to decrease trust in the government?
That's just an important point. Over time, we became more informed about either how the virus works or how vaccines works. And of course, some mistakes might have been made along the way and some restrictions that were put in place. I think we all kind of thought the lockdowns went on for a bit too long, these kinds of feelings, and that's normal. But over time, when either governments or health figures or public figures would stand up and say, okay, now we're changing tack because the information has changed as well and we're moving with it. Conspiracy theorists or extremists, they gravitate towards this. They use this because they're able to lean on this kind of uncertainty and lean on this to themselves further exacerbate hostility or fear or suspicion. In times of crisis and kind of uncertainty, conspiracy theories or support and belief in conspiracy theories increases. This is proven by research. COVID was a perfect petri dish in a way for this, because from March, April 2020 onwards, here was this very complex, very kind of amorphous. It was hard to define what exactly it was. And it happened actually quite quickly, because at a time it was just this thing that was happening on the far side of the world. And then COVID quickly spread. In this complex crisis period, conspiracy theories prosper because they offer a simplistic solution, or sometimes they offer someone to blame. So here were people who were essentially either producing themselves or promoting or kind of becoming a conspiracy theory influencer, who were saying, this is how it works. This is why it's happening. COVID doesn't exist. There's actually, the government are using this as a way to either curb your freedoms, or they want everyone to have a microchip in the arm so they can monitor their movements. All of these they're the very kind of at one end of the scale. There was at the softer edge, there was like, no, COVID is real, but the government are definitely taking advantage of it because for their own nefarious means. But here was a very simplistic solution. And for people who may have been either fearful or scared or just not sure what was going on, or they have their own other biases, or they might just not like the governing party who were enforcing the legislations, that's enough of a grain to maybe kind of to send them on the way. And what happened after COVID is what my colleagues and I would call the COVID effect, is that people who might have become interested in anti-lockdown or anti-mask or anti-vaccine kinds of opposition or activism entered online spaces where you mentioned at the top, traditional media had kind of gatekeepers where they could stand over media that was being produced or was codes of practice. In Facebook groups, in Telegram group chats, or in WhatsApp group chats, there is no code of practice. There is no gatekeeper who is saying, this article that was produced by a New York Times journalist who has 20 years experience versus this person who is producing a video from their basement and has put it on some obscure video platform that you never heard of. These things are the same. These things have equal merit. No, they don't. They're very different. But for people in the midst of a kind of who kind of have an inkling that something isn't right and they want to kind of find something that might confirm these biases or the beliefs, it can. And people who enter these spaces seeking information around masks or vaccines or lockdowns or these kinds of things then entered these conspiracy ecosystems. And since then, it really is a melting pot online. And what you can see in lots of the kind of groups that might be sharing or seeding or spreading false or misleading claims about asylum seekers right now is that if you scroll back, you can see stuff that might pop up last year around climate change or stuff that is quite disparaging towards the LGBTQ community. Or if you go back to 2020, it's vaccines and COVID. So COVID really was a kind of force multiplier. People had much more time online, and where lots of people inevitably went was towards spaces where conspiracy theories swirled. So conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists and extremists have taken advantage of this. They have done it for multiple ideological reasons. Some far right parties who are really opposed to immigrants, for example, were at one stage promoting lockdowns because it was a way of keeping immigrants out, for example. Then they changed tack and they realized there's a kind of seed of anti-government opposition to lockdowns. So why don't we try and either organize or promote or kind of get some anti-lockdown movements or protests going, and we can kind of ride that wave in our own way. So in one aspect, yes, it is to foster anti-government support, but it's also to foster anti-democratic support, because extremist groups and extremists, they prosper when people move away from kind of consensus and you give a little, you take a little, working together towards the fringes where it's more extreme. People are more willing to support you, and they do that by kind of just tweaking the levers and trying to promote extremist solutions or false or misleading claims that might support their own arguments and move people away from the kind of democratic institutions as well. So in these spaces, it's anti-government, but it might also be, in the case of Ireland, it's anti-HSE, for example, or it could be anti-Gardaí, or it's anti-EU at a wider level, these kinds of things. And yes, they also do it because they are interested in, so often the case, there's financial motivations for a lot of these figures. It could be a case of they have books they want to sell, or it has actual physical products they want to sell, or because of the way social media is built and the way that we can monetize pretty much anything via content now, you'll see that they might put a video on YouTube and then there's a link to their Patreon account or a GoFundMe, or there's other ways of kind of crowdfunding or inbuilt ways you can tip them via like live TikTok streams or these kinds of ways. Lots of these figures are trying to build their own platform and trying to build their own audience off the back of it, and essentially, try and become kind of influencers with their chosen kind of content. But the danger is that they're doing so by false and misleading and harmful narratives, and they're doing so by targeting vulnerable and minority sections of the population as well.
Yeah, so it almost appears as a sense of like gotcha, where these people are saying the government was wrong once, so they're always going to be wrong. So we've seen the rise of these well-known individuals and influencers who spread these extremist views, for example, racism, misogyny, and homophobia. So how do they use online platforms to attract such a large following? And how much of a role do online algorithms play in creating these followings?
Yeah, they use online platforms very smartly, very adept. Extremist figures, purely by their own need for survival, to find new places where they can propagate their messages. They actually have been, traditional early adopters of new forms of technology since the internet was a thing. When it comes to social media, what we've seen extremists be quite successful at is using these spaces to, well, first of all, using these spaces as a means to get their message out there. So take an anti-asylum seeker message that is rooted in white Irish good, non-white people bad, that kind of message. So they use online platforms to post content that promotes this ideology. Then they use their crowdfunding campaign or their Patreon account to try and seek financial support for this kind of ideology, and they present themselves as like as someone who's an activist or a campaigner, or they present themselves as someone who is being censored or silenced or a victim, and then you have to support them to help them get the quote unquote truth out there. They use it quite successfully, but at the other side of that, social media platforms make it relatively simple for figures. I mean, if you take TikTok, I do a lot of work about looking at extremism and hate speech on TikTok. The barriers to entry for creating something that is technically impressive and creative on TikTok is low. And that's for like 99.9% of users on TikTok. They use it for, food videos, dancing videos, whatever it might be, or reaction videos. But extremists use that platform as well, and they use the green screen effect, and they use filters, and they use specific songs, and they create trends based on songs as well. They use the features the same way that others do, but when they use these features, they use it to propagate hate, and they use it to other and target and denigrate or dehumanize groups as well. And yes, you look at the algorithmic side of things as well. I mean, a very simple measure, if you come across a video, I mean, as I have or my colleagues have, that has 1 million views and it says some very disparaging or dehumanizing things about Ukrainian refugees in Ireland, for example, but the account only has 1,000 followers or something like that, it raises questions right away about, is there some algorithmic amplification going on here? And is TikTok's algorithm, for whatever reason, serving this video to more people beyond this user's immediate network? And if it has 1 million views and it's coming from a small account like that, I think it's a safe bet that it is. And then that raises serious questions again about how TikTok might be artificially amplifying this kind of stuff. And again, that's fine when it's food and video, food and music and whatever kinds of normal, genuine videos, that's fine. But if it's being used to target others, then it becomes dangerous. And this, in different ways, happens also on different platforms. You have every platform has, well, every responsible mainstream platform has community guidelines. So what is and isn't allowed on platforms. And most platforms also, especially the big ones, have very nuanced, comprehensive guidelines on what is and isn't allowed. So, you can post an educational video that's from a documentary that's about World War II and includes a portion of a speech from Hitler, for example. That's educational, that's allowed, but you can't post a promotional clip of a video edit of Hitler and he's doing the Sieg Heil salute. This kind of stuff, those nuances are made. But what you so often find on platforms is that there's a gap. There's a consistency gap between the policies that are quite nuanced and quite understanding of how this stuff exists online versus how it takes place online. And that's something that I found repeatedly in some of my research about TikTok, is that the guidelines say this thing and they say this thing shouldn't be allowed, but you can find these videos and it doesn't take a whole lot of work to find these videos. So there's those aspects as well. And then at the other side of it, there's also platforms who just don't even try. They don't even have community guidelines. They have bare bones terms of service. So something like Telegram right now, Telegram will essentially remove child pornography or it'll remove ISIS videos. Those are generally the two things that it, and it will take action against other repeat offenders, let's say. But in the online ecosystem right now of false, misleading and exaggerated claims about asylum seekers, or about COVID conspiracy claims about vaccines, or about Trump supporting communities who are putting out all sorts of false claims about voter fraud in the US. This kind of stuff is not taken down off those kinds of platforms. And that's the kind of alternative platforms to which lots of extremists gravitate towards when they are eventually removed from Facebook. But if you're someone who's in my position or in government or elsewhere, it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, and it's very tough to try and track and mitigate against this stuff. And also, if you think of, I don't know, a live stream video from a protest and the person who's presenting it says a number of false and misleading things about asylum seekers in a 10-minute video, that might be 100 claims in that 10-minute video, for example. To create a fact check against maybe one of those claims will take a couple of hours for a journalist, but to get it, they might have to contact another professional or another expert to get that kind of expert view. They might have to go digging through government documents to find the information. And when they do produce that video, or when they do produce that fact check, it might get 10 times less engagement, and it's 10 times as long to make the claim. So you can see the challenges that are inherent in this, where it seems a lot of the time the cards are stacked against mainstream media or government or institutions around the country. And extremist figures and conspiracy theorists have a lot of advantages to make a false claim, see it spread online, and they know how to do it. They know how to get it out there and use a false claim to get people protesting. So yeah, it's a very challenging ecosystem to be working in. Yeah.
What do you think needs to be done to counter the rise of online extremism?
A lot. For online extremism, well, extremism first of all in general, and the way that we need to try and tackle that is to increase support and trust in our institutions, in our democratic institutions. So politicians first of all, yes, but also the police and also the health service, and that's a job for government to try and take aim at some of the major crises in Ireland, let's say around housing and healthcare, for example, that will naturally lead people away from extremism and extremist figures who are offering their own solutions towards the systems that work for everyone. But that won't happen tomorrow. So that won't happen, primarily online. That's kind of in the online question. It comes back to trying to block or stymie the ability for these figures to use online platforms to propagate hate and to promote extremism. The way by that which has to happen is that platforms, first of all, need to create strict policies that allow that, well, first of all, prohibit figures who might be denigrating or dehumanizing or posting denigrating or dehumanizing content about asylum seekers, for example, or other kind of topics that we typically see extremist figures gravitate towards. Then you also need to remove their ability to monetize their content and to build platforms off it. And you also need to decrease or tackle that enforcement gap that I mentioned earlier on as a way to essentially say to these figures, yes, if you're Joe Soap and you can use this platform, but if you use this platform to say very damaging and harmful things about asylum seekers or claim that they've done a number of incriminating things without any evidence, then your ability to use this platform should be limited or should be taken away from you altogether. So we need to think about platforms working together more as well, because as I mentioned earlier on, you might see a TikTok video with a false or misleading claim about asylum seekers, and it's probably a screenshot of a WhatsApp message or a Facebook post. And then that kind of shows how all platforms form part of a patchwork that is enabling extremism and hate to prosper right now. And the risk that there's very real offline consequences for this kind of stuff, and the speed at which this kind of stuff is happening right now is very damaging. And then lastly, what I say is that all these things have to work together. So the online hate bill that the government is introducing right now needs to be enforced and it needs to be actioned. It needs to be careful that its application is carefully put in place so that there's no kind of false positives caught, these kinds of things, and those kinds of guardrails must be in place for legislation. But it also needs to be implemented and used to try and snuff out the worst behavior that's ending up people being targeted and victimized.
One of the main issues I can see with kind of dealing with these kind of misinformation, disinformation is how would you see governments or companies deal with partially true claims which are being distorted by these people, like where it's a partially true claim and they apply their own opinion to it as if it's fact? What would you say would be the best way to do that?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Free speech must be protected at all times in all of these avenues. It has to be the first principle. But and so often when you see a false claim, there might be a grain of truth in it. It's kind of like is it a truth or a false? The sandwich analogy is the one that's popped up time and time again. So between two bits of truth is a false claim, and you kind of use the credibility of the first. I mean, right now there is a housing crisis, so there's a squeeze on resources. These things are true, but asylum seekers arriving into Ireland on Monday are not being given 3-bedroom houses on Tuesday, for example. These kinds of things are existing. For the government, it's very important that the legislation that is first of all drafted consults with, and this is true of the online safety bill, but also any piece of legislation concerning this area, that first of all consults people who have worked in this area or have researched it for a long time and can inform them about those perhaps implicit consequences of where things might go if things aren't considered properly. And then once it starts moving through the legislature, that it's given time for TDs to ask questions, to seek feedback, and then for it to be implemented. We can design, government can design legislation, but if it's not enforced or implemented, then it's not really worth the paper it's written on, I guess. So it's tremendously difficult to try and create legislation that allows for opinion, that allows for people to be wrong. And that's also a very important part of not countering, but kind of, I suppose, research in this area, is that people have a right to be wrong, and people have a right to get things wrong in public and to either learn from it or maybe not learn from it as well. I mean, it's about striking a balance, and it shouldn't be on one person to do this, and that's why the democratic approach to doing this and maybe taking a lead from other countries who try to do this as well is also very important. Like I said, people have a right to air their views, people have a right to ask questions and not be silenced or cancelled, or all these buzzwords that are so in right now. People need to be able to figure these things out for themselves. The flip side is that there are people, and are, be it extremist figures or political figures or conspiracy theorists, who thrive on that gray area of where truth and fiction might blur, for example.
Yeah, so we almost need to find the Goldilocks zone of free speech while also fighting disinformation. So,
Exactly.
finally, what are your top tips for how teenagers can protect themselves and others against these issues?
First of all, you need to be careful on where you get your news, and ask yourself, maybe, if I wanted to find out about I don't know, what's happening in Ukraine right now, what would I Google? Would I Google Ukraine RTE, or would I Google Ukraine and insert conspiracy theorist here? It's this kind of thing. So what is your go-to news source? Most people would recommend mainstream, long established news organizations. The reason why these organizations are still around and they have, funding and they have audiences, is because they are trusted, is because they adhere to a code of practice. Somewhere like RTE or the BBC in the UK, or even any number of the newspapers in Ireland, or news or radio stations, are all quite responsible, because they sign up to communities that require that board of practice, and that if they do step out of line or they get something wrong, they will have to either put their hands up and apologize, or they'll face further or more severe restrictions on them as well. So standing over where you're getting your news is very important. We've seen the rise of, I don't even know what to describe them. They're not news organizations. You might call them a website that does news, but they kind of present themselves as a news organization, and they might even have a verified profile somehow. Trying to distinguish between this kind of website versus RTE can be difficult, and it can be tough. And I would recommend, if you have questions over a source, Google. So I don't know, take Fox News in the US, for example. I'm using them because they're not Irish. If you have questions over how is Fox News regarded in terms of its reputation and how trustworthy it is, just Google and Google or Fox News and biases or something like this, because you might see other news organizations reporting on them. This can be quite helpful. That's the first step. Second step is, so much of us get our news on TikTok or on these social media platforms that are kind of called a sandbox, because once you're in these platforms, you don't tend to kind of go outside them. So if you're on TikTok, where links don't work unless you're on someone's profile, it's not really much use me posting a link to RTE in the comments, because you're not going to click it. It's just not going to happen unless you want to screenshot it and do some sort of image capture thing. Not happening. So if you're on these kinds of social media platforms and you see a claim coming from somewhere else, can you stand over who shared that video? Do you know this person? Are they a journalist? Are you sure they're a journalist? Are they a government figure? Can you stand over who your friend Johnny passed something or shared this video? Is Johnny pretty good for sharing this stuff, or has been known to kind of share exaggerated or false stuff in the past? Standing over that kind of stuff. And extremists thrive on really serious and emotional claims. If something makes you really angry or really exaggerated or really kind of going, what the hell is happening in a certain place down the road, it might be a good step, it might be a good reminder to step back and say, is this true? What else has been reported on this? And then lastly, challenge your friends if you feel it's safe to do so, or feel it's a good idea to do so. Call them out for sharing something that you know to be false. To say that look, this is that news source you link to, or that source you link to, they're not reputable. I've seen them post really false or misleading stuff in the past, and I'd prefer if you didn't share that before, or if you didn't make this really disparaging claim about asylum seekers while linking to that news source, or get informed and kind of work together as well. But all these things should be done in ways that are also, of course, suitable to you as well. Like, we don't want anybody kind of getting into the fight on the comment sections of some TikTok video either, unless they really want to, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. That's my tip.
You've given us a lot of insight into the world of online extremism and your work with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Thanks for joining me, Kieran.
Thanks very much, Owen.